Ellen White Reconsidered, a series of presentations for people with questions about Ellen White and her writings. Today's episode is The Missing Element in Reclaiming the Prophet. Greetings. At ministers' meetings this week, we had the privilege of hearing Jed Lake, a colleague of mine, who's a good scholar in Ellen White studies. He presented a book that has been advertised, but then suddenly disappeared. It's entitled Reclaiming the Prophet, and I was requested to review the book and to give my appraisal because there were already some concerns about it. And so I did. And besides the marks that I gave for each of the chapters and concerns that I had or minor details that I noticed, I also prepared an extra chapter, which I have entitled The Missing Element. You might consider it kind of a minority report because there are some things that I, among other people, have noticed are missing in this presentation of Ellen White. So you get the benefit of my chapter. Let's read together.
The Missing Element by Kevin L. Morgan, M.A. In all that we can say about Ellen White and how she accomplished remarkable things for the Seventh-day Adventist Church after having been the victim of an accident as a child and acting as a woman in a man's world, there is an element that has not been discussed. In looking at her life purely as secular historians, we may overlook evidence that goes beyond the merely remarkable, for there are many things in her experience and messages that are either uncanny, insightful, or prescient. The uncanny shows itself from the time she had her first vision in December of 1844. With that first vision, as she slumped to the floor, those who saw her wondered if she had died. Such would have been a natural conclusion with the obvious health problems that she suffered. She described having to sleep in a sitting posture because of the blood that would pool in her lungs in the night, making it difficult for her to breathe. In later life, describing the experience of her first vision, Ellen White used the phrase, "when my breath came again to my body." Witnesses mentioned her not breathing while in vision many times after this. The first recorded instance, and that was immediately after the event, was by James White, when she had a vision in the house of Isaac Cook Snow at Hannibal, New York. On August 26, 1848, he wrote, "Ellen rose up in vision, took the large Bible, held it up before the Lord, talked from it, then carried it to this humble brother who was not on the Sabbath and put it in his arms. He took it while tears were rolling down his bosom. Then Ellen came and sat down by me. She was in vision 1.5 hours, in which time she did not breathe at all. It was an affecting time." John N. Loughborough gathered other eyewitness testimonials of those who had witnessed Ellen White in vision not breathing, such as Merritt G. Kellogg, who described Dr. Francis Pinckney Drummond, 1822 to 1898, examining her in Tyrone, Michigan, on May 29, 1853, and being disturbed that he could not find any evidence of breathing in her, and Loughborough's own description of Dr. John S. Brown, 1815 to 1884, who, on January 12, 1861, stumbled towards the back door of the church in Parkville, Michigan, because he couldn't get out the building soon enough after exclaiming, "She don't breathe." Ellen White's not breathing in vision became so common that James White felt confident to invite people to come forward and examine her. An eyewitness of such an examination was Daniel T. Bordeaux. He described accepting James White's invitation to test whether Ellen White was breathing on June 28, 1857, at St. Lawrence County, New York. And so confident was White that he allowed Bordeaux to cover her mouth and pinch her nose for not 2 minutes or 5 minutes, but, according to Bordeaux, for about 10 minutes, after which Ellen White suffered no ill effects from not having breathed. Because people had told him that others had experienced similar phenomena, Bordeaux went to hear a Mrs. Elvira P. Parker who was residing near Bordeaux in Ennisburg, Vermont, but was originally from Morristown. He saw her in a trance and contrasted the very different supernatural element of Ellen White, which sustained her in vision, from that of Elvira Parker. The article detailing the encounter was the second published mention of Ellen's not breathing in vision. There were also experiences recounted by multiple witnesses of Ellen White holding up a Bible in vision. It was not always a big Bible, but in every case, she called people's attention to the Bible. In some accounts, she pointed to verses and quoted them without laying her eyes on the Bible. The insightful and prescient can be seen in the things she knew through visions that were more than a human could know. How is this possible? In the 1880s, she went to Europe and Daniel T. Bordeaux was there as a translator. He described how she insightfully and presciently knew the needs of the cause there and had messages for individuals she had never seen before with her natural eyes. The insights she shared stood out for him. J.N. Loughborough also published accounts of people and situations she had seen in advance before seeing them with her physical eyes. At Loughborough's first meeting of Ellen White in Rochester, New York, he saw her in vision. It is no wonder that he would gather other eyewitness accounts. That vision was right after he had accepted the Sabbath through unique circumstances. He had a dream of J.N. Andrews, which depicted the very way that Andrews would answer objections about the Sabbath from Scripture. She had messages for 3 individuals, one of which, Christopher D. Riggs, circa 1800 to 1860, was not there but was traveling on business. Another was present, Elizabeth Riggs, née Hunt, 1802 to 1900, and had a secret that she could not tell and had told no one. The third was Loughborough himself, as he was attempting to make a big decision about what he would do with his life at a time he had been supporting himself and his wife selling window sashes. Each of these messages was not just remarkable, it was uncanny. So how did she know? Authors in Reclaiming the Prophet have mentioned there being supposed errors in Ellen White's books. W. W. Prescott, at the 1919 Bible Conference, was the main source of this conclusion as a result of being asked to review Ellen White's book The Great Controversy. The plates had worn out, giving the publishers a chance to revise the book. The publishers had wanted to include attribution of sources for those who felt that it was lacking, even though one could argue that a book without footnotes that simply tells the story has a certain effect while a book heavy with sourcing has a different effect. But, for the sake of presenting a book that would make a positive effect on the general public, Ellen White directed her literary assistants to put the sources in by all means. By all means required their traveling to libraries around California to find the original sources or a substitute source that said the same thing as in the text. At Ellen White's request, W. W. Prescott made suggestions based on his understanding of history that he felt she had not correctly stated. He submitted over 100 changes, and Ellen White reviewed and accepted a little over half of them. At the 1919 Bible Conference, he described the changes as correcting errors in history, but was that the case? Among the changes that Ellen White accepted, which some might think of as corrections of historical errors, was the change of the bell that rang on the day of the St. Bartholomew's Massacre. It was not necessary to be so specific about which bell it was, when historians were divided about which bell signaled the grand, horrible event, so rather than being specific, she said a bell signaled the killing. Some have argued that her first wording was correct, and there is evidence that it was. But rather than having a great controversy over a minor matter in the great controversy, she changed it. So was that actually an error? Another supposed error had to do with Adoniram Judson, a reference she quietly eliminated because it was not a necessary element in the book. Originally, she had described the American Board of Foreign Missions as sponsoring Judson to India. It is true that, when he first set out from America, he was sponsored by the American Board of Foreign Missions, but, over the matter of baptism, he broke with that sponsorship. So, by the time he got to India, he was no longer under their auspices. Her statement was accurate until it was not, so she quietly eliminated the whole thing. Another supposed error that was changed was the statement, the Waldenses were the first of all the peoples of Europe to obtain a translation of the Holy Scriptures, The Great Controversy, 1888 edition, page 65. If one picks a later date for the origin of the Waldenses, one would say, no, there was another people group in Europe that had an earlier translation of the Bible. So, Ellen White quietly changed the wording to, the Waldenses were among the first of all the peoples of Europe to obtain a translation of the Holy Scriptures, The Great Controversy, 1911 edition, page 65. It was not crucial that they be credited as the absolute first, and yet, if you view the Waldenses as arising from those who escaped from Rome much earlier, then there is evidence that they had the Old Latin. And that would have been the first translation for peoples of Europe. Another supposed error does not come from Prescott, but from the study on the chapter about Huss by Dr. McAdams. McAdams indicates that the mistake that she made was concerning Huss's departures from Prague, and he believed, based on what he read from historians, that Huss had only gone out 2 times. But McAdams did not have the evidence to recognize that Huss himself described 3 departures, and, correlating the events, we discover that it was not only 1410 and 1412, which are the 2 departures that McAdams would recognize, but also in 1411. Ellen White was not wrong, and yet her source was, and his source was. They were confused, but she was not wrong. I do not know how to explain how she got it right, humanly speaking. There is something going on here, and I would suggest that it was divine guidance. McAdams is correct in showing that she condensed known history for the parts of the Great Controversy where she fills in between the flashlight views of great events, which she described early on in Spiritual Gifts, in her first accounting of the Great Controversy. She did condense history. He's correct about that, and she told us what she did in the author's preface to the Great Controversy. And she did the work of condensing very hurriedly, and Marion Davis condensed it further because of a limit of pages for the chapter. Yet, Marion did not add to the book according to her own understanding. McAdams misunderstands this point because he was limited in the manuscripts that he had to examine. There is an additional manuscript, to which I have had access, identified as the Jerome manuscript. With the first missing 25 pages of the Huss manuscript, the Jerome manuscript contains the adaptations from Wiley that McAdams believed that Marion had added. Thus, the assumption that Marion added this material is unwarranted. So that which has been missing in Reclaiming the Prophet, as the Ellen G. White estate has pointed out, is that which distinguishes her ministry as having a heavenly advantage. We certainly owe a debt of gratitude to the historians who have helped us to see Ellen White in her original setting historically and thematically, showing the part of Ellen White that we can connect with as a real human being, struggling with issues and problems we have to face. But we need something more than an accurate picture of her humanity. We need to know that God called her specially and provided supernatural evidence of her calling. We may be like A. G. Daniels and consider that the strongest proof of her ministry is what she accomplished, for that certainly was remarkable, and not physical and outward demonstrations in vision. But there are other indications that, when Mrs. White was delivering a message from a vision, it exceeded her own understanding, which is what left her perplexed, at times, to explain to those who received the testimony how to apply it. Her own thinking played a role in how she understood what was delivered to her. In a similar vein, we think of Peter receiving the vision before meeting Cornelius and the other Gentiles to share the gospel with them, and we remember how his first response was to think that God was telling him something about what food he could eat, and that made no sense to him. Acts 10 verses 10 to 14. It was only as Peter could connect the vision with the Gentile visitors at the door that he was able to conclude, God hath showed me that I should not call any man common or unclean, Acts 10 verse 28. A vision is not always self-explanatory until what God has revealed is brought in contact with what God intends to bring about. Ellen White wrote, early in her experience, about often not remembering exactly what was in a vision until she sat to write or she saw certain faces in a crowd while speaking. Only then did she recognize and remember what was vividly portrayed to her. After I come out of vision, I do not at once remember all that I have seen, and the matter is not so clear before me until I write. Then the scene rises before me as was presented in vision, and I can write with freedom. Sometimes the things which I have seen are hid from me after I come out of vision, and I cannot call them to mind until I am brought before a company where that vision applies. Then the things which I have seen come to my mind with force. I am just as dependent upon the Spirit of the Lord in relating or writing a vision as in having the vision. It is impossible for me to call up things which have been shown me unless the Lord brings them before me at the time that He is pleased to have me relate or write them. There are too many instances of the uncanny, the insightful, and the prescient for Ellen White's visions to simply be a woman's intuition or the product of a dream based on her previous musings. The corpus of her writings, which remains for us to read, is the melding of the human and the divine, God working through human clay to communicate to His children. This is an element of the reclaiming of the prophet that we should not overlook.
There is so much more that could be added to what I have included briefly in this chapter. A lot of the evidence you can find in my new book, Glory, 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 where I have a whole section of the eyewitnesses of Ellen White in vision. And in other parts, you can see some of the remarkable things that were revealed to her for the benefit of God's church. I hope that's been a blessing to you. Take care. Until next time.
To keep up with the latest in this series, be sure to subscribe to this channel